All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Deandra Rose, the Director of Polis, the Center for Politics, and a faculty member here at Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy. I am delighted to welcome you to our very special event today, a conversation with Senator Tim Kaine, moderated by Polis's distinguished fellow, Ambassador Miriam Sapiro. We've got a terrific turnout today, and we're excited that each and every one of you are with us to hear as our guests will discuss domestic and international challenges facing the United States and potential steps to address them. I'm pleased to introduce Ambassador Miriam Sapiro, who will then introduce Senator Kaine. Ambassador Miriam Sapiro is the inaugural Polis Distinguished Fellow at Duke University, a non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a managing director at the communications firm Sard Verbinnen, and a member of the board of directors of Lufthansa and Project Hope. She has spent more than 25 years in senior leadership roles in the public and private sectors, developing and implementing major policy initiatives and managing complex negotiations, crises, and challenges, including as acting and deputy U.S. trade representative, a senior official at the National Security Council, and an international lawyer and member of the policy planning staff at the State Department. Ambassador Sapiro and Senator Kaine, welcome. It is an honor to have you with us today. And Ambassador Sapiro, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for your very generous introduction and for your terrific leadership at Polis and building a vibrant political center at Duke. Senator Kaine, a really warm welcome to you. We could not be more thrilled that you are able to spend time with us today, especially given your hectic schedule. Before I introduce you formally, let me just say also a warm thank you to your incredible staff, to Katie Stuntz, to Maha Syed, and also to the Duke team, Meg Biddle, Braden Hammond, who worked so hard to put this event together. I think Senator Kaine hardly needs an introduction to this group, but let me give him a brief one. He is truly a superstar in the Senate. His expertise straddles foreign policy and domestic policy, and so he serves on the Armed Services Committee, on the Foreign Relations Committee. He's also on the Budget Committee, as well as the Help Committee. Help, of course, is what a lot of people across the country and overseas need more of today. In this case, HELP stands for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Senator Kaine grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and worked alongside his father in his ironworking shop. After graduating from the University of Missouri, he decided to go to Honduras to run a technical school where he taught teenagers carpentry and welding so that they could begin to earn a living wage. The senator attended Harvard Law School, where he gained not only a law degree, but met his future wife, Ann Holton, a superstar in her own right. They returned to Ann's home state of Virginia and raised 3 wonderful children. Senator Kaine has served as the mayor of Richmond, as lieutenant governor and governor of Virginia, and as the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. In fact, he was chairman the year that the DNC helped to elect Barack Obama president, which is when I first got to meet the senator. On a personal note, I have long thought of Senator Kaine as one of, if not the hardest working, most thoughtful, and most dedicated senators that we have in Congress today. I hope, Senator, that I have not made you blush too much. It's hard to tell on Zoom. There are so many important issues that we could discuss today. This is truly a consequential time for this country and for the world. We've just witnessed overnight further aggression in Ukraine that we will talk about. We're also facing the highest inflation in the United States than we have in the last 39 years. We will do our best to cover as many topics as possible. And I just want everyone to know, and especially thank the audience, we have gotten some fantastic questions from students that I'm going to build into our conversation. So let me jump right in. I first want to ask you to look back a little to last November and to the election in Virginia, when Glenn Youngkin beat Terry McAuliffe for governor, which is, of course, a position that you once held. Republicans were elated. Democrats were disappointed. We would like to know, to what do you attribute Youngkin's victory?
Well, Miriam, my dear friend, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Professor Rose, thank you. And I really look forward to the discussion. Let me start with the Virginia governor's race. And I think there's some Virginia students on this call who understand this, but for those of you who aren't Virginians, when I got into politics in Virginia, I had been a nonpartisan local official, city council and mayor, though always a Democrat. We ran nonpartisan until I ran my first partisan race in 2001 to be lieutenant governor. At that point, Virginia was redder than red. Every statewide official, federal and at the state level, we had not put electoral votes behind a Democratic candidate since 1964. Both houses of our state legislature, overwhelming dominance in our congressional delegation, everything was red. Democrats have really built since 2001, and we've made the state a battleground state, trending blue. The first reason that the Republicans were successful in November is they were hungry. They had not won a statewide race in 12 years. They hadn't won electoral votes for presidential elections in a row, hadn't won a governor's race, hadn't won a US Senate race, and they were hungry. That often happens with a party that loses enough, they get very hungry. And frankly, sometimes a party that wins many elections in a row gets a little bit complacent. Democratic turnout was strong, but Republican turnout for a governor's race was through the roof. But I don't view it as essentially a big sea change election in Virginia, and here's why. In a really good year to be a Republican candidate, President Biden's approval numbers were low. A Republican candidate, Glenn Youngkin, who's worth about $500 million and was willing to spend tens of millions of his own dollars to win, who had no political record that anybody could hang around his neck and say, you voted for this bad thing. He ran in a near perfect year to be a Republican candidate, and he won Virginia by 1.8 points. The last two who won the Virginia governorship won by 15 points and one by nearly 20 points. So I give credit to Governor Youngkin for running a savvy race. And I give credit to Republicans who turned out voters in near record numbers. One of the reasons they were able to do so is that Democrats in Virginia have made it much easier to vote than it used to be. But I don't see it as a fundamental sea change in Virginia politics. We are a battleground state trending blue, but we're not a one-party state. And all of us have to essentially grapple with the fact that we're going to be competitive likely for a long time.
Well, that's a great segue to looking to this coming November. Because as you said, the party not in power can often be hungrier than the party that is in power. So in light of what happened in Virginia and what we're seeing across the country, how do you feel at the moment about the midterm elections coming up for both the House and the Senate?
Miriam, here's the way I look at the midterms. House, Senate, and the predominant number of governorships are up this year too around the country. If people are feeling, 2 years of COVID has been brutal. We all know somebody who's been sick. Most of us know somebody who's died. We all know people who've lost jobs or maybe had their businesses seriously impacted. We've not been able to attend a baptism or a funeral, or, a lot of my friends have had grandchildren across the country, couldn't go visit them. And this takes a toll on people. And I think the attitude of a lot of us right now naturally is kind of an anxious and sour one. If you look at the American public, that's kind of what they're feeling. And I'll be honest, if that's what people are feeling in September and October, it's going to be a very tough election for Democrats, because they will always, the voters, always sort of take it out on the party in power. And the party in power increasingly is viewed as the party that holds the White House. However, I do see a realistically optimistic alternative. I'm on the Help Committee in the Senate. I see COVID numbers, Omicron numbers coming down pretty significantly. And I believe we might get to April, when spring normally makes people feel a little bit better anyway. and be seeing COVID numbers that make people feel like, you know what, for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I can start to live normally again. Our economy, job growth is through the roof. GDP growth is through the roof. Wage and salary growth is through the roof. Yes, we're facing inflation challenges. Those will get worse in the energy sector because of Ukraine, but there are some positive economic trends that match up against at least one significant negative trend. If we get to a good spot in April with respect to COVID, I could see a President Biden give 2 years in my lifetime in this country. This global pandemic, economic shocks, manifest demonstrations of racial inequities that the pandemic has revealed. This has been extremely tough, but I feel a sense of uplift right now. I see the economy correcting. I see the COVID numbers coming down. I don't think Americans are back on their heels. I think we're resilient people. And I see a sense of uplift. I see an American comeback underway. I don't think anybody can give a comeback speech better than Joe Biden, because both personally and politically, he has had to often come back from personal tragedy or being counted out politically. He's done so. If he can make that speech in April or May, and if I am right that there might be a sense of psychological uplift to replace the sort of sourness and anxiety of this moment, I don't think November has to be bad for Democrats. So that's my realistic, optimistic alternative. And we'll see what the COVID numbers and the economic numbers do. But I'm not giving up on having a good November.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it's encouraging to hear that there's some light at the end of the COVID tunnel, even if it is something that we have to live with for a while. And you're absolutely right. The economy has done better than many people even expected. But the challenge remains inflation. And a lot of people are worried that there are just too many Americans in Virginia and across the country that are still having trouble meeting the basic necessities of food and lodging. You know, people don't often look to Congress for help on inflation, but if you do have advice for your colleagues or for others, we hope you'll share that.
Well, I do think some of the inflation that we're experiencing is still the supply chain kind of interruptions and disruptions caused by COVID. And so if I'm right about COVID numbers starting to come down, I think you'll start to see some of those supply chain issues reach a different equilibrium, and that'll help us with part of inflation. Now, look, Ukraine, and I know we'll talk about it, could pose significant inflation in the energy sector. When we cut off Russian oil exports, that's probably a smart thing to do in the national security space, but it can raise energy costs here, but even more significantly in some of our allied nations like Germany. One of the things that we're still working on in the Senate is the reconciliation bill, originally called Build Back Better. We're still working to do it. It's going to be pared down, but I think what you'll see is that bill being very focused on things that will ease pocketbook pressures. Give you an example. The piece that I've worked on the most is early childhood education, universal pre-kindergarten, and childcare support. If you think about costs that really, really bite people's pocketbooks, cost of prescription drugs, healthcare premiums, cost of childcare are three of the big drivers. If we can get this reconciliation bill pared down, and we need to, but have the bill really address some of these big cost drivers, if you could save thousands of dollars a year by having universal pre-K for your children or dramatically more affordable childcare, if you can save hundreds of dollars a year, maybe thousands, with more affordable healthcare premiums and more affordable prescription drugs, then that will help you deal with the incremental increases in prices at the pump or in the grocery store. And so I think you'll see Democrats in negotiating this reconciliation bill, which we can do just with Democratic votes. We don't need Republicans as we do with other legislation in the Senate. I think you'll see the focus of that bill being cost reduction in big ticket items that really hit Americans' pocketbooks. And that'll have an anti-inflationary effect, at least insofar as people are feeling it in their wallets.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to hear you remind people that there is still hope that we can get some of those provisions through. In fact, I'm also very glad that you raised healthcare, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is whether you think there's more we can do to increase access, to improve equity, and above all, to also lower costs at the same time, because it is plaguing almost every American household.
There isn't a silver bullet on this. There's no one answer about it, but there are a number of things we can do. One, if we can get the states that haven't embraced Medicaid expansion to do so, that will provide significant benefit to their populations. I'm thinking of Georgia. I'm in New York right now. I'm doing an event with Senator Raphael Warnock later. You see my glamorous background. These are hotel curtains behind me. But if Georgia were to do Medicaid expansion, it would dramatically affect a lot of middle and low income Georgians, help them get access at a reasonable cost. You mentioned equity. One of the pieces that I'm pushing in a renegotiated Build Back Better is something that might seem like a minor adjustment to Medicaid. It will be transformative. Right now, about between 40 and 50% of the childbirths in the United States are reimbursed by Medicaid because it's low income women. And so their childbirths are covered by Medicaid. And then Medicaid will cover them for 90 days after the birth of a child. Then they lose Medicaid. Their child may have Medicaid, but the mother loses Medicaid benefit. We have a huge problem in this country in maternal mortality. Our maternal mortality statistics don't rank us with other nations in the OECD, the industrialized nations. And in particular, the racial disparities in maternal mortality are absolutely shocking. Just changing that one thing, there's a provision that I'm promoting that would extend coverage of moms who deliver babies who are Medicaid eligible for 90 days to 1 year. That's an equity move, but it will also dramatically reduce maternal mortality and other health problems that moms experience in the first year of their life. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at that are core. Democrats disagree on some aspects of the Build Back Better bill. That's why we don't have one yet. But there are also core elements that we agree on. And this notion of Medicaid coverage for mothers until a year post-pregnancy is one that is very, very powerful, both in terms of healthcare access and cost, but also in terms of equity and health outcomes.
I can't agree with you more, and really hope that measure, along with many others I know you're working on, does succeed. Let me turn to an issue I know you're focused on, and also Senator Warnock. There have been recent bomb threats to HBCUs and other educational institutions, which you, of course, have condemned. Is there anything in your view that Congress can do to address this disturbing situation?
Miriam, this is look, I am troubled by a whole set of violent activity, bomb threats to HBCUs, bomb threats to synagogues, bomb threats to mosques, vile attacks against school board members, against election officials. Our school board members in Virginia, I'm not sure it's the same in most states, but these are like parents of kids who run for the local school board. They get virtually no salary. And now they're finding themselves on the receiving end of death threats. And as somebody said to me, and this is a chilling thought, a school board member in Virginia said, when I get a death threat, and it's not just to me, but it's to my kids, I got to weigh the fact that my school board salary isn't even enough to pay for a funeral. God, when that person said that to me, I kind of got chills thinking about these, local parents who are running for this thankless job with virtually no salary just because they want to help their schools succeed. There is an unacceptable level of violence, but also threats of violence. And we've seen this spike, threats of violence spike dramatically, kind of beginning in the Trump era forward, certainly spiking after the attack on the Capitol in January of 2021. I think there are many tools. I don't think this is a matter of passing more laws, although if we need to, we should consider it. But I do think it is more a question of allocation of law enforcement resources. And and any of us in office, we face threats all the time. I've had to deal with death threats against me often, but at least there's a Capitol Police Corps that is providing protection for me when I'm on the Capitol grounds. School board members don't have that. The HBCU, sure, they're going to have a local campus security, but those campus security operations are not set up to deal with the kinds of violent threats they're receiving. So we will probably need to just devote more law enforcement and investigative resources toward this. I do think the tools and the laws and the criminal statutes are there to protect us, but we've got to devote more investigation resources to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think more resources, more vigilance would certainly start. Speaking of running for office, I wanted to ask you about term limits, because Virginia is, I believe, the only state in the union that has a one-term limit on governor. A president, of course, can only serve 2 elected terms, but there are no term limits on members of Congress or justices of the Supreme Court. Now, a fun fact that I discovered was a few years ago, Paul Carrington, who had been the dean of Duke Law School, and a few other professors from other law schools got together with a proposal for the Supreme Court. And that proposal was that the president should be able to appoint a justice every 2 years. Only the 9 justices that had been on the court for the least amount of time would hear and decide cases. The other judges would be considered senior status. So they would be there if needed. If a more junior justice had to recuse for some reason, you could pull from the bench. So I'm curious, given that Congress does play a role in defining the number of justices and a few other things, what do you think about term limits for the court? I'll start there.
I will say, Miriam, I have not been really involved in issues about Supreme Court composition. I've been very involved in filling judicial vacancies, in Virginia, District Court, Fourth Circuit. And there's sort of an interesting question about this is if you were to design it anew right now, how would you set it up versus what you might transition to given where we are? If I were designing the Supreme Court from scratch right now, the way I would design it would be, I would probably require that we have a justice from each of the appellate circuits, because too many of our justices, basically their educational and professional careers were in the Acela corridor, Washington to Boston. And I think that America's geographic diversity is a really important diversity. I'm so excited that we're likely to have 4 women on the Supreme Court. When I went through law school and graduated in 1983, there were 9 men on the Supreme Court, and that seemed completely natural. It seemed completely natural. The notion that now we're going to have 4 women on the Supreme Court makes me feel great, but we still don't have a court, in my view, that really represents the sort of geographic diversity of our nation. And so if I were designing it from scratch, I would probably say, the president gets to nominate, but we ought to have somebody from each of the appellate circuits. Now, we might have to think about whether the appellate circuits are rationally drawn, et cetera, but I'd probably do it that way. Mm-hmm. On the term limit piece, I could see lengthy term limits as a positive. That way you sort of take the politics out of when somebody retires and when they don't. If you do it for 20 years, you don't know who's going to be president in 20 years. You don't know who's going to have a majority in 20 years. And 20 years is a long time to serve. I think there have been members of the court that stayed on too long, just like there have been members of the Senate who stayed on too long. If you put a extended term limit there, you might guarantee that you're really getting people at the top of their game. So having heard that as a proposal, I can see some logic or merit to it. But you have to do it in a way where it's not being seen as like, one party trying to just gain a temporary advantage. It would have to kind of make rational sense. That 20-year idea would be an idea that doesn't seem designed to jerry-rig it for one party or the other.
I like it. I think that's an interesting gloss on the proposal that I mentioned. And there are others out there as well, but it does seem that it's timely to think about this question, especially given that there should be hearings soon for the new justice. Let me also ask you that question a little bit closer to home. How do you feel about term limits for members of Congress?
Well, I'm going to tell you something that I don't know that I've ever said before, which is I don't believe in term limits externally imposed, but I have sort of I served 2 terms as a Richmond city councilman. I served 2 terms as mayor. I could have served more than 2 terms as mayor, but I announced when I got elected to begin my 2nd term that I wasn't going to run for a 3rd term. I served 2 terms in state government, 1 term as lieutenant governor, 1 term as governor. As you mentioned, Virginia is the only state that doesn't have a 2-term governorship, and you can only serve 1 term. And I'm in my 2nd term in the Senate. I haven't made a decision about 2024, but I've never served more than 2 terms in anything. And I tend to think for legislators that we shouldn't have term limits. And I'll tell you why. My experience in working with legislators in states with term limits is that term limits become enormously empowering to lobbyists. Lobbyists are extremely active around legislative bodies. If the lobbyists are the ones that have the institutional memory because they've been around a while, and the legislature, I think that actually tilts the playing field away from voters and toward interest groups. And so I think legislative bodies, I don't think we ought to have term limits for them, but I do think legislators should grapple with the issues of not only am I effective, but also I think those of us in office have an obligation to train other leaders and then make opportunities for them. And so that explains why I've kind of done what I've done through my career: serve vigorously, encourage a whole lot of other people to serve, step aside and give other people a chance, find a new way to serve. Legislators, we have to kind of grapple with this ourselves.
No, and I think, as I said earlier, you're a model for many of these difficult questions. And I think if that approach was embraced more broadly, you may have fewer people asking the question about term limits. But as we know, some people stay a very, very long time and serve admirably, and other times people wonder. But again, I think it comes down to what would best increase diversity and also empower voters. So I think you make some interesting points that are definitely worth reflecting on. Speaking of Congress and looking ahead to next week, which at the moment seems like a long time away, but we'll be here before we know it, the president will give his State of the Union speech on Tuesday. What are the issues and themes that you hope very much to hear?
You know, I said when we were talking about midterms, you know, that President Biden could give a speech. And I think I would hope to hear some of those themes in this speech. I think we need to first hear an acknowledgement of how difficult these last 2 years have been. I am a fortunate, well-off person with a good job and a good healthcare plan. My wife and I both had COVID. 2 of our 3 adult children were laid off their jobs for months, not teleworking. I mean, laid off their jobs for months. My wife and I have known 9 people who've died of COVID, and I'm still dealing with some long COVID like nerve tingling symptoms, and we're like the lucky people, right? We're like the lucky people. So if that's how it affects me, well, we can tell from the statistics, everybody's touched by COVID, but disproportionately those getting COVID, those dying of COVID, are African Americans and Latinos. Disproportionately people losing jobs to COVID, African Americans, Latinos, young people, women. So it touches everybody, but it hadn't touched everybody equally, not by a long shot. So I hope what the president does is first just acknowledge that these last 2 years have been absolutely brutal. They've been absolutely brutal. But then I hope he'll start to lay the framework but we're comeback people in this country. We're not, you know, tough times don't last, tough people last. And we're tough people, we're comeback people. And then starting to lay in, you know, we've done an American Rescue Plan that helped a lot of people. We've done an infrastructure bill that is starting to have significant effect. We are seeing COVID numbers come down. We are seeing strong economic growth, strong job growth, strong wage and salary growth. But we still have challenges. We have challenges with inflation. We have challenges with too many people who still don't have affordable health care. We have challenges on the world stage as authoritarians are not just saying, we want to do it our way, leave us alone. They're saying we want to do it our way, and our way is the right way for everyone. I hope he'll start to lay the groundwork for, it's been a brutal 2 years, but we're comeback people and there's an American comeback underway. He's got to deal with the inflation issue. Obviously, he's going to
deal 1 o'clock
with Russia and Ukraine, but I think he can point us the way forward toward a better chapter that I believe is imminent.
I hope very much you will play a role in drafting those remarks. Maybe not with a pen or a keystroke, but at least in your conversations with the president, because I think those are both very important themes to hit in terms of the empathy, the successes to date, and then of course where the country needs to go. And we know that the last one is the most complicated, probably, of those questions. Let's switch gears and talk about international politics, which I realize could take many hours we don't have, but at least to start. Let me just ask you an overall question to let you frame the discussion in your own words, and that is, what do you see as the gravest long-term threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests?
Well, I think the biggest threat is internal division. You know, I agree with what Lincoln said in a speech that he gave in the late 1830s, is our nation is so great and the only eventual cause of its demise would be suicide. Meaning the internal, and essentially he gave this speech 20 years before the Civil War, and he was talking about slavery and regional divisions. I think internal divisions are the greatest national security threat we face. And you know, you just can't pass a law saying there should be no internal divisions, because we're a big, broad, diverse people with a lot of different ideas, but we just have to figure out how to harness our differences, whether they're regional or demographic or ideological. We have to figure out a way to harness our differences that is sort of the, you know, Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis. Let's produce a synthesis and work toward a better idea than any of us would have on our own. Outside of our shores, the big threat of the next decades is, I wrote a piece 5 years ago now in the summer of 2017 in Foreign Affairs about, you know, if Harry Truman were around, how would he be looking at the world right now? It was for the 70th anniversary of the Truman Doctrine. The world is going into a competition between authoritarians and democracies, with non-states as a third set of actors that cause trouble for both. Sometimes non-state terrorist organizations are the one thing that unify authoritarians and democracies. But this challenge between democracies and authoritarians is going to be the challenge of the next decades. And while authoritarian nations, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, there's others, they're different. They are increasingly showing a willingness to set aside their old enmities and combine. You saw this 5,000-word manifesto that Xi and Putin released together on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics. Russia and China have had additional animosity, wars, border disputes, others, but they realize in a world of democracies that have alliances like NATO or others, they don't have alliances and they need to, so they're starting to pull together. And I think this competition between democracies and authoritarians is going to be the threat, the challenge, and it's a full domain threat. It's a military threat, it's a diplomatic threat, it's an economic threat, it's a cyber threat, it's a humanitarian threat. It is a full dimension competition. We're not going to win this one at the barrel of a gun. We're going to win this one by being exemplary and showing people that a small d democratic model where individuals have both protected freedoms, but also the ability to participate and choose their own path, that is vastly preferable to living under the boot of an authoritarian leader. Ask people in Donetsk or Luhansk, these Russian-dominated breakaway republics if their life is better than it was in 2013. Donetsk was a thriving, economically productive city with a great history and a great culture that's been turned into a grim, Stalin-esque, enclave, and that has convinced Ukrainians, even Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine who aren't in the Donbass, that's convinced them we don't want to go the direction they're going.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, both in terms of the threat to this country from within. No adversary has yet brought us down. And looking outside our borders about the need to really solidify our alliances, because otherwise, if we're not joining with democratic partners, then we will not be as united and coordinated as we need to be to meet the threat, whether it's from Russia, from China. This is also a great segue into talking a bit more about the latest Putin moves, the invasion that he has launched against Ukraine, despite the warnings that he received from the US and from Europe. You, of course, have supported the president 100% of the way and condemned what Russia is doing, as have many others, both in the United States and also in terms of our allies. Even the Secretary General of the UN has had strong words for the UN to say about this. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is whether you think that there are steps that the United States or its allies can take in addition to what has already been done.
Miriam, the president has been clear that we're not going to put US troops into a ground war in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO ally. There's not a defense treaty that would require the use of our troops to defend Ukraine. If Putin were to engage in any military action against a NATO ally, we wouldn't want to have US troops in harm's way, but I can assure you we would defend our allies because our allies came to our defense after the attack of 9/11, triggering the collective self-defense obligation of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. What more can be done? First, I do applaud the Biden administration and US allies for getting on the same page with respect to sanctions. US sanctions can have an effect, but they're not near as powerful as sanctions that also have, especially in the case of Russia, strong European agreement, and we have that accord. Secondly, I got to applaud Germany. Germany really did not want to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They have a significant need. As they're phasing out coal and nuclear power, they are forward leaning on alternative energy, but they still need other energy forms, and they really need natural gas. They did not want to shut down the pipeline, but President Biden worked with the German government and basically said, even if you don't want to, you have to agree that if there's an invasion, you can't just say it's business as usual with Russia. And Germany agreed with that and then acted promptly to say that we're not going to approve the pipeline going forward. The next set of steps that can be taken, and for those in the class, Ambassador Sapiro is a master at this stuff, but the next set of steps that can be taken, I think, are largely in the financial sector, working with global financial organizations to deny Russia access to traditional Western banking resources that they really depend on. Not only does Russia depend on them, but many of the Russian leadership depend on them. That is not something that Congress can just automatically just do on our own. That takes coordination and cooperation with other Western allies. But I think a strong statement of Congress that we urge this to happen, that we would support the president and leaders of other democracies in taking these financial steps, I think it would send a strong signal, and it would facilitate those steps being taken. And I think you're going to see us. I mean, we're on conference calls heavily this week. We are on a recess week, but we've been on conference calls plotting out those moves. I think you'll see us turn to those pretty promptly beginning Monday.
That's good to hear. And I think you're right. The executive branch can do a lot by executive order, but keeping Congress united with sense of the Senate, sense of the House resolutions, showing support that this is not a partisan issue in the United States right now, I think will be very, very important. And I think the same holds true for our relationship with China. So Switching gears, so much attention right now, of course, is rightly focused on Europe. But looking to Asia for a minute, we have a situation where China is both an adversary and a competitor. Legislation is moving through Congress to try to increase U.S. competitiveness, especially with respect to our semiconductor industry. But of course, it's moving slower than many had hoped. In the meantime, President Xi, it makes no bones about heavily subsidizing Chinese sectors that compete with ours, of tamping down on human rights throughout China, but especially in Xinjiang, and also, of course, keeping Taiwan in the crosshairs. In fact, he's made no secret of his desire to try to be the Chinese leader that unites Taiwan and the mainland. So I think especially now, while so much attention is focused on Europe, to what extent do you worry about Xi making moves in Taiwan? And if he does launch an attack, whether it's a conventional attack or a cyber attack, what's your view on what the United States should do?
Well, I am about it. I know more than I can say from a classified standpoint, so I want to be careful about what I say. But let me say this: you're right that Xi does view in a very similar way Putin views Ukraine. You know, it was part of Russia. Ukraine was where Russian Christianity began on the Crimean Peninsula, and so they kind of view the beginning of the modern Russian state as having Ukrainian origins. Well, in the same way, Xi views Taiwan as more than just, you know, another issue on the to-do list. This is sort of an existential issue in his view. However, Xi also does not believe that China currently has the ability to take Taiwan by military force. He does not think that they do. And some moves in China in recent years, particularly the treatment of human rights, pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, have really turned Taiwan politics very much against. It used to be that, you know, the two parties in Taiwan, one would be more pro-mainland and one would be more pro-independence, but especially the treatment of Hong Kong democracy activists have moved Taiwanese politics very much more toward independence. The one thing that could affect Xi's calculation, even if he does not believe that China currently could militarily dominate Taiwan, is if he is worried that the US and other democracies are assembling, you know, defensive chess pieces in a way that would make it impossible for him to do what he wants. It's important that we shore up Taiwan and provide assistance. We do have a defense treaty with Taiwan. Unlike Ukraine, we do have an agreement with Taiwan that we would help them defending their territory. We have started to do even more than that. The Australia, US, UK initiative that was announced by the Biden administration. The Biden administration's kind of rejuvenation of the Quad, US, Australia, India, and Japan. These are alliances in the region that are being, elevated, and they help Taiwan deter attack. They're good to help send Taiwan the right signal, but we have to calibrate that carefully so it doesn't force Xi to think, well, I'm not really militarily yet ready to dominate Taiwan, but if I don't do it soon, the door will close. So this is a very, very matter. If there were to be an attack on Taiwan, you would see the US and allies respond in a very significant way. What would be the full dimensions of that response? You know, that is something that I don't completely know. And to the extent I do know, I can't completely say. But the Biden administration has made very plain to China, hey, look, Ukraine is not a NATO ally. We have no obligation to them. That is not the case with Taiwan. We do have an obligation.
And I think you're quite right. Just as Xi's moves against Taiwan have strengthened the US and its allies in the region, we have seen Putin's moves actually make NATO act and the US and the EU in a much more coordinated, solidified fashion than might otherwise have been the case. Let me just say on Asia for one more moment. There had been some concern earlier that the Biden administration was ceding economic leadership in Asia, which, as you know, is a vital component of our ability to lead there and around the world. Trump, of course, had pulled the U.S. out of the TPP agreement, which China is now seeking to join. The Biden administration recently put forward a new framework called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but some American exporters are worried that it's not ambitious enough because it doesn't seek any new market access for U.S. exports. Do you think the administration should stay on the sidelines of negotiating new trade deals, or, as some of your colleagues in the Senate have argued, should it try to join the new TPP agreement, but on U.S. terms?
Miriam, I think the latter. I think the U.S. not being in the TPP was a problem. I understand why it happened at the end of the Obama administration and during the Trump administration. I'm one of the 1/3 of the Democrats in the Senate that voted to give President Obama and President Trump, it was a 5-year window to negotiate trade deals under the fast track and bring it back to Congress. But I said to the Obama administration at the time, the one thing you have to fix and make very plain is if you put environmental or labor protections in this deal, and you should, they have to be as easy to enforce as the trade protections that companies want. And there was a particular, and I'm not going to get all wonky about this, but there were particular elements of the enforcement that many of us who voted for fast track urged the Obama administration, you have to give labor and environmental organizations the same path to enforcing the provisions of a TPP that you give to companies. And in my view, the end product fell short of that. It did not create enforcement mechanisms for environmental or labor organizations. And that's why at the end, even those of us who were supportive of TPP found the negotiated deal not to our liking. Could we revitalize it? Look, in the U.S., the renegotiation of NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal, we took 20 years of learning and we increased the standards, including the enforcement standards, on things like labor and environmental practices. I give I'm not a fan of the Trump administration mostly, but I give them credit where I think they deserve it. And I think learning from 20 years of NAFTA, which you should do, and making it better and making the enforcement provisions stronger, I think that does point us toward, could we make the TPP better? Could we conform some of the TPP provisions to things we did in USMCA and then potentially rejoin it? Because I want to open up more markets to American products, especially markets in Asia. The Chinese government was so happy when the US didn't go into the TPP. They really, really were afraid that we would make that work. They were happy when we didn't go in. If we could conform some of the TPP provisions to some of the things we did in the renegotiated NAFTA and get back in, I think it would be good for our economy and also good for global security.
Well, I think you're being modest because the revised NAFTA came about not just because of the Trump administration renegotiating it, but because the Democrats in Congress said these labor provisions and these environmental provisions are not strong enough. You can do better, and we won't support it until you do. So I really give a lot of kudos to you and your colleagues for making those provisions strong. Let me turn to a more personal question, if I can. Way back when Hillary Clinton announced that you were going to be her running mate, what was your reaction? Can you tell us a little bit about where you were at the time and how you found out?
Sure. Well, and I don't really talk about this much, so it's a good question because there's a piece of it that is really touching to me. I had been vetted by Barack Obama to be his running mate in 2008. I was a relatively young governor. I had been a mayor and done other things, but I was in the final two. And Barack Obama said, hey, you're my heart pick and Joe Biden's my head pick. And sometimes I go with my head, sometimes I go with my heart. I had been on the campaign from the very beginning. And I thought, I think Biden is actually the better pick for me. My whole goal is for you to win. If you ask me, I'm going to say, yes, I'll be honored. But he made the right pick in Joe Biden. Well, Hillary was vetting me along with many, many other candidates, interviewed me. There was, dozens of people, very good people being considered. At the time, 2016, Virginia was seen as very much a battleground state. Like we could lose Virginia. And so I had some virtues, governor, senator, from a battleground state. I had a civil rights background. I was fluent in Spanish as a missionary, but there were some other very, very strong candidates. And in fact, I felt like some of the others, if I'm candid, that were being considered, they might have been better picks than me politically for her. But in, the quirks of politics, they were like Senate colleagues of mine that were senators in states with Republican governors. If she had picked them, then the governor would have appointed a Republican in the Senate. And remember, Hillary was dealing with the Senate that was extremely narrow at the time. And so I was a safer pick in this sense. I had a Democratic governor. And so if she picked me and we won, then she wasn't going to lose a Senate seat. All of these factors go into play. When Hillary called, I was doing an event for Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who's my chairman on the Armed Services Committee. We were doing an event together in Rhode Island. And I had, within maybe 48 hours before that, I got the feeling like I wasn't just on a list of 5, I was on a list of 2 or 3, and I maybe had the best chance, but I was just doing my normal schedule that day. And I got word earlier in the day, hey, Hillary wants to give you a call, at about 5 o'clock. Okay, that's great. And she called. And by the time she called, I think I was with maybe an hour or 2 before that, I kind of felt like it's going to be me. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, Tim, I'd like you to be my running mate. And I said, I'd be honored. She goes, before you answer, I want to tell you why. And I said, okay, I won't answer. I'll listen. And she said, there might be people who might be politically better choices than you, although I think you're a good choice. She said, but I'm asking you because if something happens to me, I think you would be a good president. That's the kind of person Hillary Clinton is. And sadly, so many people don't understand that about her. She's very focused on duty. Again, other people would make that pick, and they have made that pick. Who's going to help me win more electoral votes? And after the election, who cares? But she was impressed. She felt on her shoulders a weight of responsibility to pick somebody, and nobody's perfect for the job, but she could see in me, well, he's been a mayor, been a governor, active in armed services and foreign relations, knows domestic policy, has a kid in the military. Nobody's perfect for the job. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Here's somebody who's been around the block in good times and in bad. If something happened to me, the country would be safe in his hands. That's the way she looked at it. And I was very humbled by that.
I think that's a very revealing story, and I think it also shows that she has excellent judgment.
Thank you, Miriam.
Let me ask you, is there anything you wish you had known about a national campaign before you were thrust into the limelight like that?
No, I will say I can't think of anything I wish I had known. In fact, one of the things that was interesting is I went to 140 cities in 41 states in 105 days as part of the ticket. And something that was comforting to me is because I had been a mayor and governor and senator, I never got asked a question where I couldn't say, I dealt with that once. Let me tell you what I think. I mean, the experience of having been at local, state, and federal level meant that I could connect. But I did have I had a worry, and it was a worry that came to pass. I said to Hillary a couple of times, I don't care what the polls say, you're the underdog. Well, why am I the underdog? Because we've never had a woman president. We're so good at so many things in this country, and we're good at many things with respect to women, but we're not good at electing women to higher office. Not only have we never had a woman president, but you look at Congress right now, okay, it's 25, 26% women. That ranks us like 80th in the world. We're below the global average if you look at the percentage of women that serve in national legislative bodies. the leaders in the world, countries like Rwanda, are 50, 55, 60, higher than 60%. When in 2016, we were lower than Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, in terms of the percentage of women in Congress. So I said that to her by way, I don't care what people tell a pollster, this has been traditionally extremely difficult. And so while I thought on election day, I woke up and voted and I thought we are likely to win, I was probably among the more bearish on the team. I think many on the team thought it was rock solid. Pollsters were saying it was rock solid. I was saying, it's probably 53, 54, 55% likely that we'll win. But I even saw trends in voting. I mean, I don't mean to get too wonky here, but Miriam, we met when we were working on the Obama campaign. On the Obama campaign, early voting started about September 20th, and we were getting early voting data. And I would always ask this question, what are we seeing in African-American turnout? And what we were seeing was it was dramatic. There were a lot of African-Americans who were like, I never thought there'd be an African-American president. It's September 21st and I can vote. I'm not going to wait till election day and get hit by a bus on October 25th and not be able to vote for the first African-American president. So the early turnout showed that there was this tremendous surge of pride among African-Americans who wanted to see the nation's first African-American president. When I was on the ticket with Hillary, I started asking that question, what are we seeing about women's turnout? What are we seeing about women's turnout? It's about the same as it was 4 years ago, about the same as it was 8 years ago. Is there no surge in early vote by women voters that would suggest that there's that same, after my whole life, we have a chance to break the glass ceiling and do so much better? And the answer was no. And that troubled me. And I still think we have such enormous double standards that we apply to women that makes it so much harder for women to be in these positions. The double standard of how we treated, the Hillary email versus Donald Trump pleading for help from Russians to help him win the election. One got talked about by the FBI right before the election. The other they were investigating, but they wouldn't breathe a word about it. There's no way to look at that and say that there wasn't a double standard that was applied. But so that was, I knew that there was a double standard applied to women, but I was a man, so I'd never experienced it as intensely as in those 105 days. Hearing people say, lock her up, watching stories about Hillary and looking at the double standard applied to her versus Donald Trump. Yeah, I knew there was a double standard, but because I'm a man, I had never experienced it quite the same as when I was the running woman to be president. Now, I will say, not all things are bad. We're going to have 4 women on the Supreme Court within a couple months. So we needn't despair of improvement. It's just that the pace of improvement is not satisfactory to me. And if it's not satisfactory to me, I can imagine what you and Professor Rose and others might think about it.
Yeah, the pace is too slow, and anything any of us can do in this webinar to move things along, we definitely should. We have time just for 2 more questions, if you're okay.
Yes.
Still? Okay.
Why don't you ask them both and let me give one answer, because I do have a...
And they actually segue, and they're both important. You'll see why. So one is to ask you how you have navigated issues involving faith and politics. You wrote a very thoughtful op-ed in the Washington Post just a year ago about how proud you were that Virginia abandoned the death penalty. You and I had both served as law clerks on the 11th Circuit, so we both worked on death penalty cases down there. I'm curious about how you have addressed situations where your faith or your conscience or your beliefs might conflict with the views of your constituents, or if you're doing political polling, how you reconcile that. And the related question is, and you'll see why I think it's related, what kind of advice do you have for students who want to follow in your footsteps into public service, perhaps even into elected office?
So the second question is actually much easier than the first to answer quickly. The first one is an everyday question, and pretty much everybody in political life, you grapple with the distinctions between your own views but I represent a constituency. I'll tell you, it's much easier being a senator than being a governor, because when you're a governor, like, okay, I am the one governor for 8.5 million Virginians. And in that role, you do feel kind of a need to harmonize different views of different parts of the state, and I represent people even if they didn't vote for me. In the Senate, there's 100 people. And each state has 2 senators. I don't feel like my job in the Senate is to harmonize everybody's views. I feel like my job in the Senate is to listen to my constituents as much as I can, do what I think is right, and then run the risk that voters might disagree with me and they'll put somebody else in office. I don't feel like I need to chase after their approval. I do have to listen to them to make sure that I'm not blindly just, listening to a few people and not seeing it from all perspectives. But I don't feel the pressure of needing to harmonize views. I just feel like with 100 people, we should all be advocating the way we think it should be, and then hope for this Hegelian synthesis in that process. On issues of faith, I am motivated by my own religion. That leaves me in uncomfortable positions with my party sometimes, and it leaves me in uncomfortable positions with my church sometimes. I'm like one of only 3 Democrats left in the entire Congress that is both pro-choice but also pro-Hyde Amendment. I believe women should make their own reproductive decisions, but I also believe that those like me who live pro-life, our tax dollars shouldn't be used for abortion. So I want to respect somebody else's choice, so respect my choice. That puts me in a very tiny group. It used to be a large group. It's very tiny now. And, I make people unhappy on kind of both sides of the spectrum with that, but that's okay. I want to do it my way. And if people decide they want something else other than what I bring to the table, that's okay too. On the what to do, if you're interested in public life, I'm going to give you one piece of advice. I've served with a lot of people in 28 years in local, state, and federal politics. There are exceptions to this, but I'm going to give you a very strong general rule. The most effective people that I have served with are people who developed an expertise other than politics and then brought it into politics. And they tend to be a lot more effective than the people who just focused on politics. I've served with people whose whole career was I was somebody's campaign volunteer, then somebody's legislative aide, then somebody's chief of staff, and I ran for office. Some of them are good. But the people I've served with who are better are the people who are the police officers or the veterans or the teachers or the small business owners or the civil rights lawyers who or a doctor or a nurse who had an expertise and then brought it into politics. Because if you do that, if you have an expertise, say you're a nurse. Well, when the health committee is grappling with the healthcare bill, everybody's going to say to you, hey, you dealt with patients all the time as a nurse. I've never done that. So what's it really like on the front line? So my advice to anybody interested in politics is develop a passion and an expertise about something that's not politics and get really good at that. And then bring that into politics. And from the first day you go into politics, people will really seek you out and defer to you because you'll be bringing something to the table and you can educate them.
This is great advice. Follow your passion and do it with passion. So, Senator, on behalf of Duke University, the Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke and DC, we cannot thank you enough for spending time with us and the opportunity to learn from you and with you. So we look forward to more discussions. And I also want to thank the audience for spending time with us. And again, we're just so grateful for your time today.
Thank you, Ambassador Sapiro. Thanks, Professor Rose. Great to be with you and hope we can do it again.
We look forward. Bye-bye.